Welcome to Election Reflection, part of Democracy on the Brink here at Free Speech TV. Early voting has begun in Georgia in the Senate runoff election. 2 Senate seats are up for grabs, and this could shift the balance of power in the Senate. Well, joining us now to discuss what's going on is civil rights activist and attorney Robert Patillo, who is with the Rainbow Push Coalition in Atlanta, the Peach Street Project. Robert, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, President Trump continues to push a false narrative around election fraud, but I know your organisation and many other voting rights groups are saying the real story is voter suppression. And in fact, your organisation has joined other civil rights groups in a lawsuit around voter suppression, the purging of 200,000 voters in Georgia. Take us through that lawsuit, the history of voter suppression in Georgia, because it's not just around the 2020 election.
Absolutely. And I think people have to understand the difference between the allegations of voter fraud and the truth about voter suppression is that voter fraud, in large part, the way that the president is articulating it, does not exist. They have not explained exactly what their justification is, or even the explanation of what the voter fraud would be. At first, they said it was the absentee ballots were being corrupted. Then they said there was the Dominion voting machines. Now they're saying there's the Secretary of State's efforts and the lack of signature verification. So it's a very moving target when they're talking about voter fraud. On the question of voter suppression, the lawsuit has been filed by a coalition of organizations, including Black Voters Matter, the Transformative Justice Coalition, Rainbow Push Coalition, as a very simple idea. The Secretary of State's office purged 200,000 voters from the voter rolls about a year ago. In September, information was discovered by the ACLU that they used an incorrect third-party vendor to select those names in order to determine who will be purged from the rolls, meaning the people who were purged had not moved or changed addresses or moved out of state or anything along those lines. So we're simply asking the federal judge to restore those names to the voter rolls and allow those people to vote. If they choose to exercise the vote, then if they choose not to, we just want to ensure that they have the right to do so without additional steps being put in place. And the history of voter suppression in Georgia is a very clear and obvious one. You can go back to poll taxes and literacy tests, questions about whether or not you can answer how many bubbles are in a bar of soap or how many jelly beans are in a jar in order to be able to vote. Land ownership requirements, which were for a long time in Georgia, reserved the franchise to only owning white men, even after constitutional amendments were passed in order to allow African Americans and women and poor people to vote. And so about 20 years ago in Georgia, we passed a voter ID law. And what the voter ID law required is that an individual had to have a state-issued voter ID in order to vote. And at the time, the state charged $10 to get that ID. The federal court struck that down as a poll tax because what they were simply trying to do was go around the requirements that you cannot charge people to vote by creating an additional fee in order for people to vote. So there's always been continuous efforts in Georgia to reduce the franchise. That's because Georgia is a purple state that has been masquerading as a red state for years. Georgia is a state that's 35% African American, 12% Latino, 6% Asian, 52% women. Atlanta is one of the largest LGBTQ communities in the country. We've had massive transplants from northeastern states seeking warmer weather and lower taxes in recent years. We've had an explosion in our colleges and universities, making the population much younger and more progressive here. So Georgia has become a purple state, and they've been using efforts at voter suppression to continue to have political power in Georgia, despite not having the demographic population. And this is best shown by the fact that the last Democrat or African American or minority in general to win statewide was Thurbert Baker in 2006. When Thurbert Baker won in 2006, the Attorney General's race, which was a statewide office, he got 60% of the vote nearly. Republicans took power in 2010. They did redistricting. They reduced the number of days for early voting and absentee voting in 2011. They made it more difficult to vote. They had stricter voter ID laws put in place. And because of that, Republicans now have a constitutional majority in the House and the Senate. They control the all statewide elected positions. They control the courts in the state of Georgia, despite all the population and demographic issues going against them. So I think Georgia, if you study, is a clear case of how voter suppression can work and how you can control a state politically, despite not having the population advantage, not having the demographic advantage, not winning the ideological argument, but figuring out how to work the rules to get around that.
Well, I know your lawsuit is seeking to reinstate those voters ahead of the January 5th Senate runoff, but there are other concerns around voter access, that some polling places have been closed, all of this in the middle of a pandemic. Early voting has begun. So what are your concerns specifically about the Senate runoff? Or do you have particular concerns? And maybe the misinformation that continues to be spread around the presidential election, do you think that will have an impact?
Well, one thing that we saw this week is that we had a record voter turnout for the first day of early voting this week. There's been nearly $500 million spent in the state on the behalf of the 4 campaigns and also the outside groups that are involved. But the concerns are very real. There's been an effort to get rid of voting absentee ballot drop boxes throughout the state, which are a new concept, a new thing this election cycle, where you can order your absentee ballot, and because people have questions about the integrity of our mail system, if you remember before the general election, there were questions about slowing down of mail service to try to slow down ballots. We have absentee ballot drop boxes where you can request your absentee ballot, fill it out, and drop it in that box instead of having to go to the elections office during business hours when most people are at work. That's a way to expand the franchise. There have been efforts to limit that. Additionally, there have been efforts at curtailing Saturday voting, which is very big for working class people and poor people who cannot come down to a government building between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on a weekday. Also efforts at curtailing the number of early voting locations. What we saw during the racial reckoning this summer, and also because of COVID, is things such as the State Farm Arena where the Atlanta Hawks play being opened up as an early voting location. Churches opening up, more precincts than ever opening up. And when you expand the franchise, when you allow more people to vote, you get a better representation of the will of the people. There's other groups that feel that you need to reduce the number of people who vote. Our Speaker of the House here, Ralston, said that if you allowed everybody to vote, Republicans would never win again. We heard similar statements from Ted Cruz and even Donald Trump nationally, saying that if you have this number of ballots, Republicans won't be able to win another election. So there's clearly one side of the aisle that is seeking to expand the franchise, and another side which is seeking to contract the franchise. So the concerns that we have going into the January runoff is to ensure that we have a fair representation of the will of the people, regardless of which party wins. We just want to ensure that there's a free and fair election where everyone who wants to cast a ballot has the ability to cast a ballot, that ballot is counted, and that the representation of the state matches the political will of the state and is not simply selected, or that the rules aren't being played with to favor one side or the other.
Well, there's a lot of attention now on Georgia because of these 2 crucial Senate seats. Let's look at one of them in particular. The Democratic candidate is Pastor Raphael Warnock. He is the senior pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. I know that's a church that you yourself attend, but it's also the church that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached at in the 1960s. Now, excerpts of his sermons, albeit very selective excerpts of his sermons, are being used and weaponized against him. And he's being labeled not just by his opponent in the Senate race, but by other Republicans as a radical liberal. And that is being used, in a derogative way because he is espousing progressive ideas. Take us through that and the history of that kind of vilification of any type of progressive platform.
Well, it's very interesting that there's a couple different kinds of theology, a couple different ecumenical backgrounds that you can approach both politics and church with. On the one hand, you have the prosperity prophets, people like Paula White who talk about money all the time. There's no problems for some reason. For certain groups, certain conservatives, there's nothing wrong with talking about money all the time, and that's not a radical idea. The idea of pastors having jets and airplanes and those sorts of things. But then there's the revolutionary version of theology, which talks about healing the sick, ministering to those who are downtrodden, making governmental power match the words of God. And if you want to get a perfect example of that, that is Moses going to Pharaoh saying, "Let my people go." That is that version of radical theology. That is Jesus walking into the temple and flipping over the tables of the money changers. That is radical theology. So when Pastor Warnock preaches, he is preaching in the traditions of people like Jesus Christ, people like Moses, people like Martin Luther, nailing his treatises to the door of the church, or the Protestant Reformation. In the traditions of people like Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and much of the civil rights movement, that is the version of Christianity that he is preaching for. And for Kelly Loeffler to attack that, it's not an attack on Raphael Warnock. It's an attack on Christianity. It's an attack on the body of Christ. It's particularly an attack on the Black church, because we've seen Amy Cody Barrett during her confirmation hearings. They made it very clear that it was off limits to attack her Catholic faith, and I thought that was a proper standard to have. We don't attack Pat Roberts. We don't attack Jerry Falwell for the things that they say. We don't attack many religious leaders, because we understand that your religious tradition is divergent from your public policy. It can influence it, but it should not be something to be attacked. Kelly Loeffler does not believe in those things. She believes that it's completely fine to attack someone's faith, to attack biblical verses, to call a Baptist minister a liar during the debate. Instead of referring to him as Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, the honorifics that he has achieved and earned, she only referred to him as radical liberal. That is a way of showing dominance, of showing disrespect to him, because she has no level of respect to him, because she is a privileged woman who has $500 million. And instead of explaining to the people of Georgia where the $500 million came from, what her particular educational background is, what her career background is, what her plans are for the state, she's decided to simply run a campaign based on attacking the Black church, attacking Black ministers, and taking words out of context instead of diving into what her actual ecumenical traditions are. And she had one commercial where she said she's more conservative than Attila the Hun, the genocidal maniac who killed millions throughout the Asian steppe. So I don't think this is an effective strategy, and more so, I think that it rubs people, particularly in the South and in the Bible Belt, very raw to see someone attacking sermons, using sermons as attack ads and commercials, because you have nothing else to run on. So as far as the Loeffler campaign goes, I think that in the final weeks of the campaign, they should use some efforts at building a biography out, instead of simply saying you're the most pro-Trump candidate, which she has said, say how you're going to be the most pro-Georgian candidate, how you're going to be the most pro-American candidate. And I think Pastor Warnock has done a great job of articulating a positive message, which really is running on facts and running on ideas and concepts which many people in the religious and in the Christian community believe in.
Well, this idea that is put forward, not just by Republicans, but even mainstream Democrats, that you cannot talk about progressive ideas and you cannot run progressive candidates in mainstream elections. There was some leaked audio from a meeting that Joe Biden was in with some civil rights leaders a few days ago. And he almost said, tone down the language, particularly when it comes to defund the police. He says, this is an issue I'll deal with, but let's not talk about it in those terms. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing. But what are your thoughts on that? That even, the mainstream Democrats want to run in a moderate way and are always saying that these progressive candidates won't win, when of course there's a track record exactly the opposite where they do win.
Well, the good thing about being in a nonpartisan group, about being activist, is that you don't work for any party. Nobody controls you. No one tells you what to do. And because of that, you can run on the agenda items that you believe in. And once the election is over, I believe that everyone will celebrate. You'll be very happy for whoever wins, and then you'll go back to doing the work. Understand the things that the mainstream media says are radical or liberal or progressive. Those are things that 60, 70, 80% of the American people support. I don't think that healthcare is radical. I don't think that housing is radical. I don't think that feeding children and clothing the poor, I don't think those are radical ideas. And I think that as long as we are afraid of those and scared to talk about them in a frank and honest way, you continue to get political stagnation. Conservatives do not worry about being too radical. When they're talking about $1.5 trillion in tax cuts for the rich, that's radical to me, but they're not described as being radical. When we're talking about a $750 billion military budget. That seems pretty radical to me when you're spending more than the next 20 nations on earth combined as part of your policy position. So that seems radical to me. So instead of being afraid of the label of being a radical, run on those positions and explain to all the American people how that benefits them and how we can ensure that we have public policy that really helps the American people and not simply the precious few at the top.
Well, Robert Patillo, just in the last moment that we have, we're a very divided nation right now. More than 75 million votes for Donald Trump. Those voters aren't going anywhere after Inauguration Day. How do we move forward in the face of those divisions?
We have to talk to those voters instead of demonizing them. We have to find out what was it that motivated them to vote for a game show host to run the country. Talk to them about issues of Social Security and Medicare. That socialism is not coming to destroy you, but rather we have to have a society that's built on prayer, a society that's built on helping everyone, and that the way to do that is through having the types of governmental system that helps to level the playing field. So we have to bring them back into the fold instead of trying to exclude them out. And I believe that once you build that society and campaign and talk and work with them, they'll realize that instead of running on division, that bringing the country together is the best way to go forward.
Well, Robert Patillo, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.